What happens when a late-night host decides to throw out the script and challenge one of the most controversial figures in modern celebrity culture? The answer involves a verbal sparring match that left studio audiences gasping, producers scrambling, and social media exploding. This is the story of how Seth Meyers went completely off script during what was supposed to be a friendly promotional interview with Meghan Markle, turning a routine late-night appearance into television gold that nobody saw coming. If you want to see how this unfolds, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this gets intense. Seth opened with his usual warm welcome. Please welcome Meghan Markle, everyone. The applause was generous as Meghan settled into the guest chair, beaming at the audience. Thank you so much for having me, Seth. I am thrilled to be here. Well, we are excited to have you. So let's talk about your podcast. You have been interviewing some fascinating people, sharing their stories. Tell us about your approach to these conversations. Meghan leaned forward slightly, her media training kicking in. You know, Seth, I think what makes these conversations special is that I bring my own lived experiences to them. Having walked in so many different worlds, from Hollywood to the royal family, from America to the UK, I can really connect with people on multiple levels. When someone shares their struggle with identity, for example, I understand that because I have been there. Seth nodded, but something in his expression shifted. That is interesting. So, when you interviewed that homeless advocacy worker last month, the one who had been living on the streets for 3 years before turning her life around, you connected with her experience? Absolutely. I mean, obviously I have never been homeless, but I understand what it feels like to have your life completely upended, to lose everything you thought you knew about yourself. When I left the royal family, I felt displaced, uncertain about my future. So when she talked about not knowing where she belonged, I could really relate to that feeling of displacement. The studio audience was still with her, but Seth pressed on. Right, so her 3 years sleeping in doorways and your move to a $14 million mansion in Montecito, those feelings of displacement are comparable? Meghan's smile flickered for just a moment. Well, Seth, I think trauma is trauma. Everyone's experience is valid. Just because someone has resources doesn't mean their emotional journey is less difficult. Sure, but do you think there might be times when making those comparisons could feel, I don't know, tone-deaf to people who are actually struggling with basic survival? I think that is a very narrow way to look at it, Seth. Pain is pain. When I was dealing with suicidal thoughts, when I felt completely isolated, those feelings were very real. Should I not share that just because I lived in a palace? Seth leaned back in his chair. No, of course not. But there is a difference between sharing your own story and inserting your story into someone else's, isn't there? The audience was starting to sense tension. Meghan's posture stiffened slightly. I am not inserting anything, Seth. I am creating connection through shared human experience. That is what good interviewers do. Is it, though? Because I listened to that episode, and in a 20-minute conversation about homelessness, you talked about your own experiences for about 12 of those minutes. The actual homeless person got to speak for maybe 8. That is not how I remember it. Well, I took some notes. Seth reached under his desk and pulled out a small notebook. Should we go through it? Meghan's media-trained smile was working overtime now. I think you might be mischaracterizing the conversation, Seth. Am I? Because at minute 4, when she started talking about sleeping in subway stations, you interrupted to talk about how you felt like you were living in a prison at Buckingham Palace. At minute 7, when she discussed not having access to mental health resources, you spent 3 minutes talking about how the royal family wouldn't let you get therapy. At minute 12, when she talked about people walking past her like she was invisible, you compared it to how the British press made you feel unseen. The studio had gone noticeably quiet. Meghan was no longer smiling. Seth, I think you are taking things out of context. The whole point of the podcast is to create dialogue, to show that we all face challenges. But whose challenges were being centered in that conversation, Meghan? I think you are being quite unfair right now. Am I being unfair, or am I just not giving you the softball interview you expected? The tension in the studio was palpable now. Meghan straightened in her chair, her voice taking on a sharper edge. I came here in good faith, Seth, to talk about the important work I am doing, giving voice to people who need to be heard. Right, But are you giving them voice? Or are you using their stories as launching pads for your own? That is incredibly offensive. Is it more offensive than telling a homeless woman that you understand her struggle because your mansion didn't feel like home? Meghan's face flushed as she processed what Seth had just said. The audience was dead silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't late-night banter anymore. This was a confrontation. "I never said that," Meghan replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You are twisting my words, Seth. This is exactly the kind of behavior I dealt with from the British tabloids." "Actually, let me quote you directly." Seth flipped through his notebook. "You said, 'I know what it's like to not feel at home anywhere. When I was at Frogmore Cottage, I would stare out at these beautiful grounds and feel completely empty inside, like I was homeless in my own life.' Those were your exact words to a woman who hadn't had a roof over her head in 3 years. Context matters, Seth." "You're right, it does." The context was that she was talking about sleeping in a park bathroom because it was the only place she felt safe, and you responded by talking about feeling empty while looking at beautiful grounds from your cottage. What context am I missing? Meghan shifted in her seat, her media training clearly being tested. "You know what, Seth? I think there is something deeper going on here. Are you uncomfortable with successful women who speak their truth?" The audience murmured at this deflection. Seth raised his eyebrows. "Are we really going to do this? Are we really going to turn this into me having a problem with successful women when I'm questioning whether you're centering yourself in other people's stories?" "That is exactly what you are doing, though. You are attacking me for being vulnerable, for sharing my experiences. Would you ask a male podcast host these questions? If a male podcast host spent 12 minutes of a 20-minute interview talking about his own mansion while interviewing a homeless person, absolutely I would ask these questions. But let's talk about another episode, since you think I am being unfair." Seth flipped to another page. "Your interview with the single mother working 3 jobs to support her kids. Beautiful story, really inspiring woman. But somehow you managed to spend half that interview talking about how hard it was to be a working mother when you had to do royal engagements while pregnant. A woman working 3 minimum wage jobs, and you compared your struggle to having to wear heels to charity galas. Being pregnant and having to maintain a public schedule is incredibly difficult, Seth." "I'm sure it is. But is it 3 minimum wage jobs difficult? Is it choosing between groceries and rent difficult?" "You are being deliberately obtuse. I never said my experience was worse." "You didn't have to say it. You just took up half her interview time talking about it. She wanted to discuss how she manages to be present for her children despite working 80-hour weeks. And somehow that became a conversation about how you struggled to balance royal duties with pregnancy." Meghan was clearly getting frustrated now, her composure slipping. "Seth, what you are doing right now is exactly why women, especially women of color, hesitate to share their stories. You are weaponizing my vulnerability against me." "No, Meghan, I'm pointing out a pattern, and bringing up your race as a shield when someone questions your behavior is exactly the kind of thing that makes people roll their eyes." The audience gasped audibly at this. Meghan's eyes widened in shock. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Look, nobody should face racism, ever. The way some of the British press treated you was absolutely wrong and indefensible. But using that as a way to deflect valid criticism about your professional behavior is different, and you're smart enough to know the difference. I cannot believe you just said that on television." "Why? Because nobody's supposed to point out when someone uses identity politics as a shield?" "Meghan, you can be a victim of racism and also be someone who centers herself in other people's stories. Both things can be true." Meghan stood up slightly in her chair, her voice rising. "You have no idea what I have been through, Seth. None. You're right, I don't. But I know what your podcast guests have been through because I listened to them try to tell their stories while you kept interrupting to talk about yourself. That is not what happened. Then let's talk about the veteran with PTSD. Remember him? The one who served 3 tours in Afghanistan, came home with severe trauma, lost his marriage, his job, ended up living in his car? Of course I remember. That was a powerful conversation. It could have been. But 5 minutes in, when he started talking about his nightmares, you cut him off to talk about your own mental health struggles in the royal family. When he tried to explain what it felt like to lose everything, you compared it to losing your privacy when you got married. A man who lost his leg in an IED explosion. And you're talking about losing privacy. Mental health struggles are mental health struggles, Seth. Are they, though? Are they all the same? Because it seemed like this veteran thought there might be some differences. He actually said, "Well, that's different from what I went through." And you said, "Pain is pain. We all suffer." You dismissed his attempt to distinguish between different types of trauma. I was trying to create connection. By minimizing his experience? By suggesting that your media scrutiny was comparable to combat trauma? Meghan was getting visibly agitated now. You are misrepresenting everything. Am I? Because then you spent 10 minutes talking about your suicidal ideation, which is serious and I'm not minimizing that. But it took time away from him talking about his combat experiences and his recovery journey. His episode was supposed to be about veteran mental health resources, but somehow it became the Meghan Markle show. Everything becomes the Meghan Markle show according to people like you. People like me? What kind of person am I, Meghan? She paused, realizing she had walked into a trap. I didn't mean. No, finish the thought. What kind of person am I? The studio was electric with tension. Meghan looked around, seeming to remember where she was, that cameras were rolling, that this was being broadcast live. Seth, I think we've gotten off track here. Have we? I think we're exactly on track. You came here to promote a podcast where you supposedly give other people a platform to tell their stories, but the evidence suggests you use that platform primarily to talk about yourself. That is your interpretation. It's not just my interpretation. Have you read the reviews? The New York Times said your show had a troubling tendency to eclipse guests with personal anecdotes. The Washington Post called it empathy theater, where the host seems more interested in performing relatability than actually listening. Critics always have something negative to say. What about your listeners? Have you read the comments? I wanted to hear more from the guest. Why did Meghan take over the conversation? This was supposed to be about the guest's story. Those aren't critics. Those are your audience. Meghan's jaw was tight. Cherry-picking negative comments is easy to do. Is it cherry-picking when it's the overwhelming pattern? When guest after guest gets interrupted so you can relate their experience back to your own royal drama? Royal drama? Seth, I lived through something unprecedented. My story matters too. Of course it does, nobody's saying it doesn't. But when you're interviewing other people about their stories, maybe that's not the time to make it about your story? Seth's last question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan stared at him for a long moment, her composure completely fractured now. When she spoke, her voice was ice cold. You know what, Seth? I think I understand what this is really about. You're threatened by a woman who refuses to be silenced, who won't play the game the way you think she should. Meghan, this has nothing to do with you being a woman, and everything to do with you being a bad interviewer who makes everything about herself. The directness of this statement sent a visible shock through the audience. Meghan's mouth fell open slightly. Did you just call me a bad interviewer on national television? I called you what the evidence suggests you are. Look, I've been doing this for years. I know what good interviewing looks like. It's about serving the guest, drawing out their story, making them feel heard. What you do is use your guests as props in your own ongoing narrative. That is the most insulting thing anyone has ever said to me. Really? More insulting than racism? Because a few minutes ago you were telling me how hard your life has been. Meghan's face went red. Don't you dare minimize what I've experienced. I'm not minimizing it. I'm pointing out that you minimize everyone else's experiences by constantly comparing them to your own. There's a difference. You have lost your mind if you think you can sit there and lecture me about empathy and understanding. Have I? Let's test that theory. Tell me one thing you learned about that homeless woman that wasn't related to your own experience. One insight about her life that you didn't immediately connect back to yourself. Meghan opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I'm waiting, Seth said. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to play your games. It's not a game, Meghan. It's the most basic requirement of interviewing. Learning something about your guest that isn't about you. The fact that you can't answer that question proves my point. I refuse to engage with this hostility. Calling out professional shortcomings isn't hostility. It's accountability, something you seem allergic to. Meghan stood up abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. Actually, you do. We're live. and walking off would just prove that you can't handle being questioned about your work. She sat back down slowly, her hands visibly shaking with anger. You are enjoying this. I'm not enjoying anything about this. I'm doing what interviewers are supposed to do, which is ask hard questions, something you apparently never learned how to do. I ask hard questions. Do you? Because I listened to your interview with that climate activist, the one who's been fighting oil companies for 20 years, and your hardest question was asking her how she maintains hope. Then you spent 15 minutes talking about how you maintain hope despite media criticism. Environmental activism and media criticism both require hope. Sure, but she wasn't there to talk about your media criticism. She was there to talk about oil spills and corporate malfeasance. But somehow that became a conversation about your resilience journey. Everything connects, Seth. That's what good storytelling is. No, Meghan, good storytelling is about serving the story you're supposed to be telling, not hijacking it for your own purposes. I give people a platform. You give yourself a platform. Your guests are just there to provide you with jumping-off points for your own monologues. Meghan's voice was shaking now. You clearly came into this with an agenda. My agenda was to have a conversation about your work. The problem is that your work is problematic. And you can't handle anyone pointing that out. Problematic? My work gives voice to important issues. Your work gives voice to you talking about important issues. There's a difference. When that domestic violence survivor tried to talk about rebuilding her life, you interrupted her to talk about rebuilding your life after leaving the royal family. When that cancer patient talked about facing mortality, you compared it to facing public scrutiny. Do you see the pattern? I see a man who can't handle a strong woman. There it is again. Every criticism becomes about sexism or racism or some other form of discrimination. Meghan, what if you're just not as good at this as you think you are? What if the criticism is valid? The criticism is rooted in people's discomfort with my authenticity. No, the criticism is rooted in your inability to let anyone else be the center of attention, even on their own show. Meghan was barely containing her fury now. You have no idea what it's like to have every word you say dissected and criticized. Actually, I do. I'm a comedian and a talk show host. Everything I say gets dissected. The difference is I don't use that as an excuse to make other people's stories about me. This conversation is over. Is it? Because we still have 8 minutes left, and I'd love to hear you defend that episode where you interviewed the teacher working in underfunded schools. What about it? She was trying to talk about her students' needs, about the lack of resources, about how she spends her own money on supplies. And you spent half the interview talking about how you felt underfunded emotionally by the royal family. That was a metaphor. It was narcissism. She's buying pencils for her students with her grocery money, and you're complaining about not getting enough emotional support in a palace. You are twisting everything. I'm repeating your own words back to you. That teacher said, "Some of my students come to school hungry," and you said, "I know what it's like to be hungry for validation." A child going to school without breakfast and you not getting enough praise from your in-laws are not the same thing. Context matters. Yes, it does. And the context is that you consistently minimize other people's struggles by comparing them to your own much less serious problems. Less serious? Seth, you have no idea what I've been through. I know you've been through media scrutiny and family drama. I don't know anyone who's been through homelessness, combat trauma, domestic violence, cancer, or poverty. Because every time they try to talk about it on your show, you change the subject to your own problems. Meghan was breathing heavily now, her media training completely abandoned. You are the most condescending person I have ever met. And you are the most self-centered interviewer I've ever encountered. We're even. I help people tell their stories. You help yourself tell your story using other people as supporting characters. There's a difference. The studio was completely silent except for the sound of cameras running. Meghan looked around, seeming to realize that this had gone far beyond what anyone expected. Seth, I think we should wrap this up. Should we? Because I'd love to know how you justify taking up 2/3 of an interview about childhood cancer to talk about your own struggles with fertility. That's enough. Is it? Or are you just not used to being called out? Meghan stood up again, this time removing her microphone. I'm done! And there it is, folks. When confronted with her actual work product, Meghan Markle walks away rather than defend it. I guess some conversations are harder to hijack than others. As Meghan walked off the set, the audience sat in stunned silence. Seth looked directly into the camera. "We'll be right back after this commercial break, assuming I still have a job." The cameras cut, but the damage was done. What started as a promotional interview had become a masterclass in how not to handle criticism. And the internet was about to explode with reactions, analysis, and takes that would dominate social media for weeks to come. If you want to see more breakdowns of celebrity interviews that went completely off the rails, make sure to subscribe and comment below with which celebrity meltdown you'd like us to cover next.